So for you all know me, but for the people out in TV land, I'm Diane Hirschberg, faculty here at ISER, and it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Alexios Antypas.
That's right.
Okay, I got it right. Dr. Antypas is actually, I'll give you the rest of his bio, but he's here right now at UAA as a visiting professor co-teaching an honor seminar with Mara Kimmel on global environmental governance, and we're very excited that this class is happening this semester. But he comes to us from the Central European University in Budapest. He's an associate professor and head of the PhD program in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Policy there. And he specializes in environmental policy and governance, and has published widely on environmental policy issues, including climate change policy and politics, multi-level governance in the European Union, environmental justice, and so on. And so we're very excited to have him talking about a really current topic right now, the upcoming climate talks that are going to be occurring in Paris in December.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so the ambition for this talk then is to prognosticate a little bit. And this is the Research Center for the Social Sciences and Economics. You know how hopeless that is. But I'm going to do it anyway because I think that we can anticipate with some degree of confidence some of the outcomes, and we can certainly identify many of the uncertainties of the COP in Paris that's coming up in just a few months, a couple of months. So what I want to do is, first I'm going to do a little background, and because I want to set the politics up with just some of the objective facts, because they do drive the politics to a large degree. So this is a graph everybody is probably quite familiar with, even if you don't follow climate change very much. This is the exponential rise in CO2 emissions, other greenhouse gases, methane, and so on as well. Follow a fairly similar trend. Well, this is really bad, and so the world is on a collision course with some climate destiny you probably would like to avoid. But how do you do it, given that CO2 is at the heart of industrialization and economic activity in general? The moral position, well, there's some very important graphs here, and we need to contrast them and keep in mind the contrast between them in order to understand the politics. So these are the historical emissions, and you can see in the blue, that's us, the United States, 27%. Well, that's quite a lot for one country, representing about 5% of the world's population. The EU 28, with Croatia, represents 25%, so pretty much the same. So the industrialized world, the developed world, no surprise there, kind of got there ahead of everybody else and has put most of the CO2 into the atmosphere. CO2, by the way, pretty much going to be around for roughly what we put out now for roughly 10,000 years. So think of it as permanent for human purposes. And then here's China, very important, and Russia. So China only having contributed about 11%, 1.4 billion, 1.3 billion people at the moment. But here's the bargaining position. These are current emissions. Looks really different. So the U.S.'s contribution has shrunk considerably. China's has shot up. The EU, practically insignificant. Now, 10% is a lot, but remember, it's 28 countries. It's 28 countries. So it's really small per country. India and Russia, quite noticeable. And then there's the rest of the world. And the rest of the world includes most of the OECD countries, well, all of the other OECD countries. I mean, Canada and Japan, so on. So so this graph. So these are really different, right? And these two facts, these contrasting facts, play a large role in negotiations politically. Here, this is where we're at. This is very significant. So up here, the very rapid rate of increase of CO2 emissions, that's China and India. And there's the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world, not doing a lot. The ones that are non-OECD and other OECD countries, they are increasing a lot from 1990, okay? but nothing compared to China.
Which one's the United States?
The United States is the dark blue here.
Okay.
Okay, so we are, I mean, I've got this on the slide, but we're at about 1994 levels of CO2 emissions. We've come down quite a lot. I mean, we're not back down to 1990 levels, as you can see, but we're practically back down to 1990 levels. Very close. European Union gradually decreasing. Don't forget the Kyoto Protocol. But so what this tells you is that while other OECD countries besides the United States and the European Union do matter, while other non-OECD countries do matter, rates are increasing, emissions are increasing, it's China and India that really matter. And it's China that really matters because China has much greater emissions. Don't forget this graph. So India is there at 6%. China's there at 24%. But those are the two countries that matter because that's where you get the increase. Now, the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's a whole bunch of different negotiating blocks. Thank God I'm not going to go over these. This is just to demonstrate that it's a complicated thing. The most important one for the developing countries is the G77 plus China. And the G77 plus China are remarkably consistent in maintaining cohesion within the UNFCCC, despite the fact that there are, smaller blocks. Basic, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, very powerful, emerged in 2009. The least developed countries, Alliance of Small Island States, neither of which is powerful, but has a strong moral kind of voice. European Union umbrella group, that's where the United States fits, along with Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Russian Federation, Ukraine, countries like this. Environmental Integrity Group, a strange combination of Mexico and Switzerland and South Korea there for the environmental integrity. Caribbean states, ALBA, the Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua radicals, and so on. And of course, traditional regional groupings at the UN, such as, regional ones are Africa, Latin America, Europe, Eastern Europe, and so on. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones. OPEC gets together sometimes there, and So it's a zoo of competing blocks. But really, what it all boils down to is the G77 plus China, or just China, basic, okay, being really important. European Union is going to say yes to everything. Nobody pays attention to the Europeans anymore in these negotiations. They have always meant to be the leaders. But why? Well, it's for this reason. They've already done so much, and they are already committed to doing so much more that, they don't have much negotiating power. China has the negotiating power here. But here's the United States position. This is 1997. And this has been the United States policy ever since. Okay, this is a sense of the Senate resolution from 1997. I believe it passed 98-0. There were a couple of people not there. It was absolutely unanimous. Saying that the U.S. would not enter an agreement, a binding agreement, unless developing country parties also agreed to limit their greenhouse gas emissions within the same compliance period, and that it wouldn't do harm to the U.S. economy. That's why the U.S. pulled out of Kyoto. That's why, and the U.S. has been consistent through all the presidencies ever since with this position. It's begun to change, but subtly and a little bit under the radar with the Obama administration. Contrasting to that is the Rio Principle 7, the Rio Earth Summit, 1992. It's also where the Framework Convention was open for signature. Established the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It's, for the developing countries, the single most important principle guiding the development of the climate negotiations and agreements. And it's a principle that developed countries have had a hard time accepting, although they have, as you'll see. And basically what it says, although we have common responsibilities, they're differentiated. And developing countries are always going to have different kinds of commitments in environmental, in terms of environmental governance globally and the pursuit of sustainable development. And it's right there in the preamble of the Framework Convention, also in 1992. The largest share of historical and current emissions. Now, as you can see, that's changed, right? So it's only the largest share of historical emissions. But current emissions, the balance has changed. Moreover, as you can see with that graph, China and India is changing very quickly, even more, tilting towards that, which of course does change the politics. The greenhouse gases has originated with developing countries. Per capita emissions in developing countries are still low. And therefore, I'll just have to skip, and therefore, the principle, one of the first principles states that, of the convention, that decisions will be made on the basis of common but differentiated responsibilities and equity. And so you'll always hear those terms from developing countries, always. And they stand on that. But what about those per capita emissions? And we saw how big China's total emissions are, but the per capita emissions were really small. Yeah, I mean we're about 4 times as much.
How soon before China overtakes the European Union in per capita emissions?
Oh, well, I don't know the answer to that, but I think
how
that
recently
almost.
did China overtake the world average? That could help.
Well, that was about 2005.
Yeah, I mean China's certainly, yeah, and the numbers are not absolutely certain, but their per capita emissions will grow. Their I think within estimates are maybe in 20 years their historical emissions will exceed ours, something like that. That's coming fast too, but currently this is where more or less where the world stands, and here's kind of color-coded sort of way where you can see how it distributes. So you can see that the just on the basis of the facts, the politics have to be extremely complicated. If you want to talk about equity, if you want to talk, there's a very big trade-off in these negotiations between effectiveness, kind of current need and the needs of the atmosphere, and equity, historical responsibility, common but differentiated responsibilities, right? And you see that in contrasting current emissions with historical ones, and contrasting current emissions with per capita emissions, and the principles that are embedded in the convention. So some very quick highlights. 92 Framework Convention is signed. 95, the Berlin Mandate, which operationalizes common but differentiated responsibilities. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then the Kyoto Protocol, of course, which implements the convention, the first binding targets, but it's insignificant. In terms of long-term impact on the climate, it's insignificant. The 2009 Copenhagen Accord, has everybody heard of that? It was the thing that everybody loved to hate. It was said to be a huge failure, but in fact it wasn't. Copenhagen Accord, it's no wonder that if you're not following climate negotiations, you haven't heard of it. Copenhagen was meant to be the conference of the parties where the agreement that we're going to reach this year was reached. Mm-hmm. And it didn't happen. But something else happened, and something else, because of this background, the bird-hide kind of approach that the U.S. took, and remember it's 2009, bird-hide approach that the U.S. took, the strong position that the Chinese and others have always taken on common but differentiated responsibilities. So Copenhagen tanked. There was no legally binding outcome from Copenhagen, but there was something called the Copenhagen Accord. And the Copenhagen Accord was this thing kind of put together by Obama and the Chinese premier and a couple of other people at the very end of the Conference of the Parties. It was the largest meeting of heads of state since, I think, 1992. Lots of heads of state were there. The Chinese were there, the Indians were there, all the Europeans were there, Obama was there. And what they did was they took about 5 heads of state, excluded the Europeans completely, went into a room and wrote up this thing called the Copenhagen Accord, which was basically a voluntary, it was what's called a pledge-based system, okay? So each country would say what they would do. It was all very voluntary, but what was which of course was panned by all the environmentalists and everybody else. Moreover, small developing countries and the Europeans were very upset because it was done without them. It was put before the entire body and got adopted with all the countries kind of, being quieted and still protesting till the end. But what it did was it got the developed and the developing countries, and it got the two major players together to agree on something. And it was not, in my opinion, it was not a failure. I think it was a great success. And the treaty we will get this year is based upon the Copenhagen Accord. No, people won't say that because it's like a dirty word. It's like it's like a swear word among diplomats and environmentalists. But it forms the basis. It also forms the basis of the structure of the new agreement that we're going to have. And this is where the Americans take a big turn. They really start working with the Chinese, and the Chinese took a big turn there too. And then we have the Durban platform, which we're working on now.
Mr. Say, have we been making progress towards our commitment?
We have been making progress towards our commitment. And you can see the trend line too. Of course, some of that has to do with the economic slowdown, but the economy has picked back up, and the trends are still quite good for the United States. They're heading in the right direction. Absolutely. Yeah. So what the Berlin Mandate did and how it operationalized common but differentiated responsibilities is it on the basis of the convention, Annex 1 countries, which are the developed countries and Eastern European countries, had to take on quantified emissions reductions economy-wide. So that's what what the Kyoto Protocol was. And the Berlin Mandate stated that unambiguously developing countries would take on no. Non-Annex 1 countries are the developing countries, and that's the kind of lingo in the negotiations. They would take on no commitment. So Kyoto is really just Europe, some of the other OECD countries. And the U.S. opted out at the end. It was top down, so certain percentages, Ukraine will reduce by 8%, Germany by 6%, something like that. The ambition was relatively low, so in the end, it didn't really make much difference for the climate. Common but differentiated responsibilities, Annex 1, non-Annex 1 countries embedded completely, totally defined the Kyoto Protocol, had little effect. And there is a second commitment period that is going on now till 2020 because G77 insisted that there be a second commitment period in order to be on board with the current negotiations for a new universal treaty. Now this is where we're at. In 2011, the Conference of the Parties agreed, so after the successful fiasco of Copenhagen, 2 years later they agreed to produce a new protocol, other legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. You know that, of course, lawyers wrote this, arguing about each word. In fact, indeed, it's so tangled because the issues are controversial. We'll come to some of those. Durban gave a mandate to deal with mitigation, adaptation, finance capacity building, technology development transfer, and transparency of action and support. So the new agreement is going to be built around these factors. Absolutely. But we won't have too much time to talk about those. But what this means is that there's going to be a balance, a shift away from mitigation only. Mitigation means reduction of emissions. That other things, especially adaptation, but also finance, technology transfer, are going to play a larger role in the new agreement than they have previously. So what kind of agreements can you have? You can have a top-down one. The environmental community, for the most part, would like to see a top-down one, I think, or would have liked to. A Kyoto-like protocol where countries will go out and say, and sort of have a legal responsibility under international law, which of course is a softer kind of responsibility, but translated into domestic law, to take on 10, 15, 20% reductions over given periods of time, and so on. Very idealistic, but politically really not feasible to have that. Well then, what the Americans really pushed and what we had in Copenhagen was a real bottom-up approach, okay? That's kind of realistic thing that you can do. Everybody just says what they're going to do, reports to the Conference of the Parties, and it's all voluntary. So there's no coercion. The top-down approach is coercive, right? Countries don't like to take on coercive kinds of obligations. Or some kind of hybrid approach, which is actually what we'll end up with. A mixture of hard or voluntary targets, that's a kind of hybrid approach. Or top-down monitoring, reporting, and verification with bottom-up commitments. This is the most likely outcome. Gradations of commitment, so least developed countries versus, a spectrum from the least developed to the most developed countries. That they would do different things, thus maintaining common but differentiated responsibilities. And and then a big question on how much, and I'll come back to this at the very end, how much temperature targets are really going to drive the commitments. And what this means is, the world has said, the international community has said, we want to stay below a 2 degrees Celsius increase. So if that's, the question is that aspirational, or is that going to drive the commitment numbers? Is it kind of something we hold out there, or are we going to do the math and say, well, in order to stay below 2 degrees, here's how much we need to reduce in this amount of time? So that's very much up in the air, too. I'll go a little bit faster and then just get to the Paris negotiations. I see it's a long talk, actually. Big question is the issue of differentiation. Are we going to differentiate between different, aside from the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 split? The world has changed. This is what the developed countries say. The world has changed. G77 holds together very tight, but the world has changed. And we saw that in the first slides, since 1992. Countries are developing very quickly. So you could have middle-income countries in one group, least developed countries, rapidly emerging economies, and so on. The U.S. is in favor of such an approach. That should or might reflect a variety of contributions. Okay, this is the U.S. statement, and it seeks this kind of differentiation. Developing countries, both within the climate change negotiations and outside of them, see this as a threat because it's a way of, kind of divide and conquer. That's how they perceive it. It's not necessarily meant that way, but it's perceived as a kind of divide and conquer. Now, this is a little bit, I'll contrast this 2-year-old statement from China with what they said just now in August. They've come a long way. So when they started on this, they were very, very clear. In fact, the Chinese were the hardest on this issue. That the Durban platform is under the convention, will be guided by the principles. By that they mean common but differentiated responsibilities. The dichotomy between developed and developing countries is the very foundation of the convention regime. And then they finally end by saying attempts to modify or recategorize developed and developing countries would delay progress in the Durban platform process with nothing to come in the end. Kind of, pretty clear statement. And in terms of differentiation, they say absolutely not going to happen. Okay. This is 2013. Well, what happened last year? The United States and China made a bilateral deal on climate. And it is, in my opinion, the single most important political factor coming into the negotiations. And this deal can pretty much tell us, in a very general sense, what the outcome in Paris is going to be. Because at the end of the day, at the moment, it's China and the US and the capacity of these two countries to agree that will bring everybody else along. There are some wild cards. India is a wild card, a little. But These are the two most important players. Again, most of the world is powerless, isn't making any contributions anyway. The other OECD countries will follow the US lead. China, Russia, you don't know. There's a few you don't know. The Europeans will just follow the US lead too. So China and the US pretty much have the control of this negotiation. China's CO2 emissions have risen 171% in those 11 years. They've agreed to a lot of things, to produce 20% of electricity by non-emitting sources by 2013. From 10% now, they're going to invest 1.7 trillion, representing 79% of all energy investments in clean energy. They mean to peak their emissions in 2030. That means getting off their exponential growth pattern. But they're going to keep increasing until 2030. Whereas the U.S. is going to continue to decrease immediately. All right, 26 to 28% for 25 levels by 2025. The EU has committed 40% by 2030 from 1990 levels, so they've really taken on bigger commitments. Percentage-wise, but don't forget they just have lower emissions to begin with. And the fact is that the future of the climate and the regime really has more to do with what China does than anything else. Now, this agreement is panned by a lot of politicians and others in this country. Why? It's very different. Remember, bird high, comparable commitments. That's what we want. Are these comparable commitments? No. The U.S. is reducing absolute emissions now, and China is going to continue to grow until 2030. So, depending on your politics, you might say this is an unfair deal. This is a bad deal for the U.S. So let's take a look at that. What are the implications for China? This is really matters. You have to think like a Chinese politician and plan it. Well, the red line is business as usual. That's what business as usual looks like to 2060 for China. The blue line represents immediate cuts right now, doing basically what we do, leveling out right now. So they're going to increase to 2030, but it only gets them to here. It's a huge departure from business as usual. It's massive. And it's not like they can continue to do what they're doing until 2013 and then start to do something to meet their obligation. In fact, they have to start doing it now. That accounts for the 79%. And they are. They have a lot. They're doing probably more than anybody in the world right now to rapidly try to get off the track that they're on. Again, just kind of the background here is just comparing the U.S. and China. Annual emissions, cumulative emissions, per capita emissions. So from the Chinese point of view, it looks like they're making enormous concessions to the United States and to the developing world. That's what it looks like. They don't feel like they owed this. But what they're worried about, of course, is climate change. And they're trying to balance their concern about climate change with their economic and political needs. So this is what it looks like. That's the rest of the world, this is China, and that's the US. So, yeah. So that's their peaking in 2030. And also, an issue not to forget is that one of the reasons that China has such high emissions is that we, not only the US, all OECD countries, barring a few, have exported their manufacturing to China. So in a sense, we are continuing to emit, but we're emitting from China. In this complex, globalized world, that's an issue, yes.
Can you give the 3-second source of that?
Oh, no, I can't. Not right now. I'll find it for you. I can find it for you after.
That's a great graph.
Yeah, I find it for you after. It is a great graph. Yeah. So, I mean, China's domestic consumption is higher than its exports, but it's still a very much export-driven economy. And of course, the ecological footprint in general of Europe has a lot to do with having exported goods to China. All right. So this is the current statement that the Chinese have had. They've reiterated their commitment that the new agreement will be in accordance with the principles and provisions of the convention, so they're being common but differentiated responsibilities. They mention it here. contribution should be comprehensive, addressing mitigation and all of the other issues. And now they say, we believe that ambition and effectiveness will be achieved by maintaining differentiation among developed and developing country parties in each element of the agreement. This will enhance participation and efforts by all countries. That's a very, very different statement from, where is it? This one. Nothing to come in the end. All right? These are suggestions, and they're soft statements, and moreover, they're not qualified by what it means. So what it actually means, we'll see in a moment. What the U.S. is concerned, so the Chinese are still making statements on the basis of principle, and they're very concerned about these principles. These principles, at least in a face-saving sort of way, be maintained. The U.S. is very pragmatic. The U.S. has taken a process-oriented view under the Obama administration, and the basic idea that the U.S. has for this agreement is that, yes, the pledges will be voluntary, but the review process. The emphasis is on the review process, because what they want is this. Over time, the last bullet point, over time, eliciting quantified estimates of present and future emissions from all parties, except the least developed countries and small island states, will produce an upward motion, will increase the pressure on countries to revise upwards their commitments. That's what they want. They want to rely on monitoring, review, and verification as the mechanism by which effort will be increased over time.
Transparency and shaming.
Transparency and shaming, reporting. They're very concerned about the quality of the data. So they're really focusing on these MRV and these procedural issues. Yes, exactly. Should be flexible based on their party's real-world capacity, so not top-down. So it's very pragmatic. So what can we do now? But then let's make it very transparent and create mechanisms for pressure to increase. So if you look at the U.S.-China deal, what you see, we've come a long way from the Byrd-Hyde era, and we've come a long way from the era of the Kyoto Protocol with this very clear differentiation between countries. The U.S. and China are both saving face, but this present administration and the Chinese government, my take is that they're very serious about getting an agreement, and they're both very serious about climate change. So it's a really different and very, I think, hopeful world, although I think that we can expect a lot of negative press on what comes out. And the reason is this very first fact. I think it's a fact. We will not see commitment pledges that will keep us to the 2 degrees. In fact, we'll probably be way off. So, but remember this emphasis on process. So we'll see what that process really looks like. The deal will have linkages so that you'll be able to meet your jurisdictional requirements or commitments elsewhere. Okay, so like the flexibility mechanisms in the Kyoto Protocol, joint implementation, so on. So calling flexible instruments, market economic instruments.
What's that a euphemism for? Really, when you talk like, sorry, I know.
Well, it means like if you
the words
can't.
people use, but it's sort of, it sounds like a way of saying there'll be loopholes.
There can be loopholes, yeah, depending on the instrument. So like with deforestation and forest degradation, they've been trying to close loopholes. But the whole agreement will, the Kyoto Protocol had this, right? So the ability to, if you can't meet emissions targets here, that you get reductions somewhere else and they count towards your targets.
You can buy portions of the Amazon or whatever.
You can buy portions of the Amazon. You can help. I mean, there's an economic efficiency issue. You may have very efficient factories in the United States where the cost per unit of CO2, reduction is very high, whereas you can invest that same amount of money in Africa and get way more reductions. Well, probably not Africa, but China, right? So if you can then get credit if you're making the investment. So there'll be a lot of instruments like this.
Now, the charts that you have shown where the U.S. go like this, you haven't included that.
No, because the United States isn't a part of Kyoto. The European countries have some of that.
Yeah,
Yes.
the reason I'm trying to figure out is if you actually have a global agreement and you have these you can meet your commitments outside your jurisdiction. What that other jurisdiction presumably has also made some kind of commitment. So how do you
Yes.
make
Well,
sure that it's in addition to what would already taken place?
it's like this, because we're going to have this hybrid approach, right? And they're calling them now intended nationally determined contributions. Weird, a lot of negotiation about that because developing countries, China, they needed to drop the word commitment. So we've got the word contributions. They thought commitment was too strong. But everybody's going to have these. So again, huge departure from Kyoto. It's a universal thing. So everybody's going to go under this heading of the INDCs. But what they actually are going to be they're going to be very differentiated. So the least developed countries, so a lot of countries like China will continue to increase their emissions. So because of that, it's quite feasible to have flexible mechanisms.
Well, can you give me an example of how it actually worked? Where if you have, how would you know that you've actually, if you made a commitment and you say, okay, I can meet this commitment more cheaply by reducing somebody else's emissions, well, that other person.
That's why the accounting and the monitoring and
Yeah.
the data are so.
Well, now there's a long history of that under the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. And so,
yeah, but in the Clean Development Mechanism for a protocol, you were typically reducing emissions for countries that had no commitments.
right.
Now you would be reducing countries that have already made nationally determined contributions, and so,
We'll see how that works out.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Potential for snake oil.
There is a lot of potential for snake oil, and there is in Red Plus too. That's exactly right. Exactly.
So are you going to talk about how this is likely to play into U.S. politics to see if the United States will live by its commitments?
Why don't we talk about that in a minute? I think some things to look for are the MRV requirements. How strong will it be? Is there going to be an effective procedure internally so that commitments will be revised upwards or no? Flexibility and review is a part of that. Will there be new market mechanisms? I think the answer is probably yes. There'll be some new market mechanisms. Will they be slippery? Will there be leakage? Will the MRV requirements be tough enough to catch problems with them? We'll see. There will definitely be finance for both mitigation and adaptation, but what the balance is very much up in the air. Probably there'll be new improved mechanisms for technology transfer, and probably there'll be a new mechanism for loss and damage, both acute and long-term kind of chronic problems, especially for small island countries that are being hit by sea level rises, more catastrophic weather events. But it's a controversial issue, so we don't know where that's gonna end up. Given the fact that the ambition is going to be low, relatively, we're not going to hit the two degree target in this round of negotiations. These other factors play the largest role. So the quality of the agreement you're going to have to read very closely. Quality of the agreement can't be determined on the basis of the cumulative effect of the current commitments. At least I would argue that it can't be. Current negotiating challenges. Well, it's a little bit fragmented. There's a lot of spin-off groups. They've got a working draft of the agreement, but it's very unwieldy. It's got tons and tons of bracketed text with many options. Very hard to make heads or tails of it. It's very unclear, I think, what the role of India will be. So they can be a spoiler, but they're indicating that they would like to take a leadership role. So that's a big surprise because in the last few years they've been more spoilers. And it's also unclear what role the 2 degree limit will play collectively. Will there be some, because if it's a general aspiration, then you can avoid making quantified mitigation, determining when peaking has to occur, creating emissions budgets and so on. My guess is it'll be a general aspiration.
How well understood is the amount of emissions needed to stay within the 2-degree limit?
Well, my understanding isn't much better than yours. So, but my understanding is it's pretty well understood, that the models are, but I go as much on faith as any other non-modeler on that question. So I was just this morning looking at the headlines, because we're getting pretty close. EU united for ambitious binding agreement. Guardian, yes, okay. UN says Paris climate pledges won't stop dangerous warming, but what will? We'd all like to know. They're probably right. At least the current pledges won't. That's right. That's very clear. Hollande is saying Paris climate talks could fail. They're in Paris, so he'd like to hedge his bets and lower expectations, I think. Huffington Post asks, what will happen at the Paris Climate Conference? Good question. I think we're all asking that question. The one that I like the best is science suggests the time is right for a climate change breakthrough at the upcoming Paris conference. And the reason for that, I actually read that little article, and the reason that they cite is exactly this. And I think they're right. And I think one thing I didn't mention, but I actually had it in a slide, and it just pertaining to current events, is I won't be surprised to see that the issue of climate refugees comes up. It hasn't really been on the agenda, but possibly linking the UNFCCC with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has been talked about in the past, and I think that the current refugee crisis is going to have a role to play in these negotiations. So thank you very much. And yes, domestic.
Yeah. I believe America's domestic politics has sort of an OCD problem, right? Obama compulsive disorder. Anything he agrees to, the idiot Republican Party says will, create disaster. And so, how do the commitments the United States makes, even if they're voluntary commitments, sort of play out to actually have something happen in our country?
You probably know more about that than I do, but what I know is that the commitments that the U.S. made, I was rushing a little bit because I realized I had possibly a few too many slides for this time allotment, but the commitments that the U.S. made with China are already built into U.S. policy. So under the Obama administration. So whereas the Chinese are taking on very heavy, but of course they have a much more authoritarian top-down government, so they're possibly a little bit more, confident that they can pull this off. But the U.S. is, because they're taking on commitments that are beyond their current what they would achieve. The U.S. has taken on commitments with China that are within what we've already put into place on vehicle emissions and other
coal regulation and stuff.
Yes.
Ask it a different way. Obviously, the Republicans are, with this OCD, are doing what the opposition party always does, which is try to prevent anything from happening until they hopefully could get a different person in the White House. Suppose we do have a Republican in the White House a year from now.
Yeah.
Or whatever, a year and a half.
What happens?
And they repudiate whatever Obama agreed to. What do you think the impact would that be on the global agreement?
Well, the answer can only be speculative. I think it would be profound. I think it would be similar to the Bush, repudiation of the Kyoto Protocol, and I think it would put the U.S. in a very difficult position. In fact, I don't see a Republican administration pulling out of these commitments for that very reason.
Well, because the international pressure would be.
Yes, because there would be so much loss of prestige and influence, not just in the climate talks, but elsewhere. And because the U.S. targets are achievable, they're not onerous.
They're not wonderful. That's true. They're not very. they don't really encompass a whole lot, actually.
Right, exactly. I mean, again, remembering that the new agreement is gonna, I don't know what the math will be, the analysis will be. My guess, 3, 4 degrees, maybe higher,
Yeah, which is,
something like that. So
that's a global
the
average.
U.S. is betting, and others as well, are betting on having a solid process within the Conference of the Parties that drives up that ambition over time. It's a very pragmatic approach to this. It's a pledge and review system with emphasis on the transparency, the monitoring, review, and verification, hoping that over time the regime evolves. It's not unrealistic because international regimes do evolve like that.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually.
Yeah.
So,
It means basically that if what you really care about is getting an agreement, it looks quite good.
Right.
If what you really care about is limiting global warming and the consequences of it, it doesn't look particularly good.
What's the alternative, man?
I don't know.
Should we be doing an Iran, rip it up and hope that something better happens?
Well, I don't know. I think the United States, whatever, we're in the United States, but there are two things that I find really problematic about this, and that is that the discussions continue to be based on country totals and commitments that countries will make for incrementally changing their emissions, whereas anything that would be remotely credible to a global community that isn't sort of dominated by the United States and China would be starting with per capita emissions, and what's the per capita amount that's, and everything else we look at and we compare per capita income, the UN Human Development Indicators, they're all basically per capita, and here we're not even looking at that.
But why wouldn't we look at it in the future?
Well,
I mean,
the point is that we have, in terms of structuring an agreement, the agreement, if you start structuring in per capita terms, China doesn't look that good compared to other developing countries, for example. If they want to say we're a developing country, we should have a different thing. Well, maybe you should have, if you want to be a developing country, you should be like other developing countries. It's just an
maybe
example.
the other developing countries should be like China.
Well, that's right. I mean, the point is you'd have a different dynamic. And the other thing that's really curious to me is why this has not, there are many other international agreements that are very tightly connected. And when you showed the slide about, the Chinese emissions that are exported in their products, it made me think, well, we have the World Trade Organization, which has been going around for a long time, and obviously there's nothing you can do in there that isn't going to be, can have repercussions in the WTO. And so I'm just wondering why there's never been any serious consideration of the WTO addressing these the issue of leakages and responsibility for monitoring and all that.
Well, I think
obviously it doesn't address all the emissions because what you do in your domestic economy that doesn't export doesn't really affect it. A lot of stuff is.
it's not under the WTO's mandate, and the UNFCCC would be hostile to that idea because they would like to keep negotiations within their purview. But I mean, you're right. Like a very hard approach to to an agreement would be to set the 2-degree target at a certain time, at the end of the century, create a budget, an emissions budget for the world, distribute it on a per capita basis, flexible per capita basis since population is changing, and that would be it. But that is a completely politically infeasible.
I was going to say maybe the Messiah will come too.
Right. It's exactly on that level at the moment. But I would say that the main accomplishment here is getting a global agreement. Kyoto was not a global agreement. It was just a few countries, and it wasn't the right countries. It wasn't the countries that could make any difference. They worked hard to meet their obligations, for the most part did, but it didn't make much difference to the climate in the long term. This agreement is going to have all countries in it. It's going to have the most important countries in it. So, and what I tried to lay out at the beginning, which did take a lot of time, and I went through it laboriously because it's so important, is that these countries have come a long way. They've come a long way just to be there and just to be on the brink of having any agreement at all that is global, that involves the U.S. and China. And that is, yes, you're right, the ambition isn't enough, but that's a starting point. And the ambition is still, it's still significant. Well, can we get to a per capita kind of discussion internationally in the future? Maybe. I would say that this would be a step that's necessary in order to get there.
Now, I'm assuming this is not a treaty, therefore it doesn't need Senate confirmation. All it needs is, it's a voluntary commitment, therefore Obama can sign it.
And we don't know what it's going to be.
As if it's a treaty, everyone will just, anything that needs a treaty, I assume that internationally people just write off the U.S. because the U.S. won't sign any treaties.
So we'll see what they come up with. We'll see what they come up with. For that very reason, they want something. I mean, the Durban commitment, something that has legal force. Okay, but that's why they were very fudgy with the language, because they know that there's a lot of domestic politics all over the place. The Chinese don't want a treaty either, so we can guess that it won't be a treaty.
Right.
Yes, but they'll treat it like a treaty, and it's written as a treaty. I mean, the draft text is a treaty text. The Copenhagen Accord was a very informal thing. It was 2.5 pages long, just very, very general, and then with pledges sort of appended to it subsequently. This is an actual. The document is a treaty document. Maybe they won't call it a treaty, and we'll have to go through that process of ratification.
Well, it does strike me that if, with respect to the U.S., if what you need to do is, the U.S. will not, the leaders can only get so far ahead of the body politic. And so this agreement is in part designed to provide both the international pressure and the verification mechanism to slowly move the body politic as they see stories and climate change and stuff like that. And that seems to me to be Obama's aim.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Very pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think they might even be willing to go further if they could, but I think they see this as kind of what's achievable.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I think we're just about at one.
But one more question.
Oh, one more
Yes.
question.
So I know technology transfer has kind of been one aspect that's kind of failed in just about every conference, and it's always been so supportive. Like, we need technology transfer because it can be so beneficial, but due to intellectual property laws, stuff that just hasn't been at all successful. So do you think that there's maybe some hope for technology transfer policies?
It's a good question, and I can't give you an answer with a lot of certainty because I haven't tracked it for over a year where they're at. There's a technology transfer mechanism under the.
What does that mean? I'm sorry.
So, technology transfer and finance for developing countries, so that they, as a form of aid, basically, investment in there. No, but the technology as well, so that we bring cleaner technologies to developing
So this
countries.
is patented technology that normally there'd be some kind of ownership and we're trying to
Sometimes,
share
I mean, that can be an issue. Yeah, that can be an issue. Of course, developing countries are often scooping up our old industrial equipment and bringing it into their countries, but it's old and obsolete here or in other developed countries, has bigger pollution problems.
We still get the financing part, but
It's a generic, it's an umbrella term.
It's an umbrella term.
Give sort of another take on that is that during the next 20, 10, 15 years, China is probably going to do more technology than we are, because they're going to have to work a lot harder, and they're the ones that are going to be in the position to transfer the technology, not us. And they probably will just do it.
I think what China has
They're
done,
already doing it with
It's
PVs.
in their interest, yes.
yeah, South-to-South cooperation is increasing a lot. I think what China has effectively done is they've abandoned their in practice, they've abandoned the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 distinction. But rhetorically, in order to save face, they're acknowledging, I believe in their commitments, they're acknowledging the change in their situation, and that their responsibilities have to commensurately change. I believe so. So I think you're right. We'll see a lot of South technology transfer. They're creating financial mechanisms, very low level. I mean, not very much at this point. So, Alex, I don't really know the answer to your question. Technology transfer has been such a perennial thorn in everybody's side. You're right, it hasn't gone very far ever, and it's been on the table for decades. So, but it's one of the items that was prioritized to determine they may ramp up the mechanism, they may pour more money into it. Yeah.
Are they also making an effort, it seems like, to have the actual maximum acronyms for actual executive conversation?
Yes. Yes.
That's what it seems.
It's much worse. The reality is much worse. The negotiators can speak in acronyms. They can speak full sentences in acronyms.
So,
And they're always changing too.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.